Okay, välkommen allesammans. We have a very special episode today. I have Stefan on from the YouTube channel, The World Tree, and we're here to speak about Slavic paganism. Thank you, Stefan, for coming on.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you're calling from, you're in Serbia now, right? But you're originally from Macedonia?
Yeah. I was born in Macedonia. Basically, my father is of Serbian origin. My mom is of Macedonian origin. They met in Yugoslavia when that was the same country, you know. So then after the breakup, that's where I ended up. But at the moment, I'm in Serbia. And yeah, who knows where I'll be next month.
Yeah, that sounds great. So he's Stefan is one of the few people that is really into the Slavic paganism, and there has been some scholarly work done on it, but there is just so little information we have on it. But a lot of people in the east of Europe who are very interested in learning these things and learning the old ways of their ancestors in pre-Christian times. So that's what we're doing this video about, and hopefully we can inspire some people. So I guess the first question is, if someone was to start, if someone was to look more into Slavic paganism, what kinds of sources are there that they would be learning from? Are there written sources from old times, or are they using archaeological evidence? What is kind of the evidence that we'd look at when trying to discover what they believed in?
Yeah, so when somebody wants to get into Slavic mythology, I would say one of the problematic things for the people of Western Europe, let's say, or people who are not of Slavic countries, is the lack of literature on the subject, because most of the things that are published are in Slavic languages. Yeah. And but there's a lot of the primary sources which are about Slavic mythology are at least in English, most of them at least, and they are available online. The sources are basically, you can divide them in three groups. There's the Slavic sources. The Slavic sources are the ones that come later, because they are basically after the Slavs accepted Christianity and the writing of the alphabet and blah, blah, blah. The ones that come from pagan times are actually either Western Latin sources. Those are primarily German bishops like Otto of Bamberg, Adam of Bremen, Saxo Grammaticus, the Gesta Danorum. There's also Helmold with his Chronica Slavorum. There's Titmar's Chronicon, and there's the Knitlinga Saga, I think it was called. Yeah, those are the sources that people mostly use for getting into Slavic mythology, to see the lifestyle of the people, how it was, but again through the perspective of these Christian monks. Then there's the Eastern Roman sources, but they don't really speak a lot about it, because in reality they didn't even really care about the culture of the people. They just had this is the Byzantine Eastern Roman for those. Because they didn't really care about how the people lived and what their culture was. They just most of the things that come from them are like warfare journals or things like that, how the Slavs are fighting and so forth. There are some moments about how they live, but there is one especially specific source that always appears. That's Procopius from Caesarea, where he writes that basically the Slavs don't know about destiny, which is wrong, as we see from folklore, but that they worship one god above others, who is the creator of lightning, and that they sacrifice cattle to him and other animals. And aside from that, they worship forest nymphs and sacrifice in rivers and in forests and so forth. So we see a lot of, we don't have a name here. So this is like in the early Middle Ages. And then the other sources of the Western Slavic tribes that appear like in today's Germany and Poland. They are from much later times. They're all from the 9th or 10th century, 11th, 12th even, you know. So there's a big gap between these things. But yeah, so those are the sources. From the Slavic sources, I didn't mention any names, but I would say the primary chronicle is an important, that's a Russian chronicle, written by Nestor the monk. There is the Czech chronicle of Dalimil, the Chronica Bohemorum as well, and the Polish chronicle of Jan Długosz, I think his name was. So these are kind of the sources that kind of all of the scholars rely upon. There are some other sources from later periods of time, for example, from Russia, some Christian sources that say, oh, you shouldn't be worshipping this, and this, they're demons and Satan, you know. Those are kind of later sources, but still valuable. I don't exactly remember the names now.
Yeah, we can link all of those. We can put them in the description, because there's so many, and it's like, I think it's kind of like the Norse too, that it's not, that it's very difficult. It's maybe just a few little parts of it, right, that tell something about the actual beliefs of the people, but otherwise it's just a historical chronicle. So it's a lot of work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
To read through all of it.
I think that I would say if one looks at the sources that are for Slavic mythology, one would learn nothing, I think, because I would say the real mythology is in the folklore, kind of, that has survived and that is recorded in the 19th century, because a lot of practices survived. So I kind of visualize this as the sources being on top, you know, like this historical information, but kind of dry from context, you know. Then you have the folklore below, which kind of gives you a deeper meaning behind all of it, you know, when you connect the dots. And then we have, you know, the common European or Indo-European or wider even comparative mythology studies. Because Slavic mythology is not recorded. You know, for example, Norse mythology is recorded. We have the prose and the poetic Eddas, right? And we have myths of the gods and everything, but we don't have these things with deities from the Slavic mythology at all. So what's happening now is actually folklore is used by the scholars to fill in the gaps, basically, in a way that they reconstruct myths. So
then that's kind of like taking all the sources and all the important parts of all the sources and putting them all together. We'll get into that. I have that's the last question for you. If any book recommendations from like more modern scholars, but are there any types of archaeological things too that are used to learn about it? Do you find any like statues or little pieces of jewelry that could be gods, or any types of artwork that could reflect anything of the beliefs of the time?
There are Slavic archaeology is very complicated because it goes into the topic of who the Slavs were, where they came from, did they come from anywhere, blah blah blah, and the problem is that the hypothesis that we have now, that they appeared somewhere on the border of Russia, I mean on the border of Belarus and Ukraine, and then just spread, you know, is just totally debunked. I mean, this doesn't hold water anywhere anymore. And the reason why Slavic archaeology is problematic is because we treat it as Slavic. I mean, in the sense that we treat it as like Slavs were this ethnic group that all of a sudden appeared. But the fact is that they weren't. You know, we have this term given from the Eastern Roman historians who were speaking about the tribes who lived along the river Danube, on their border, basically. And these tribes themselves, they didn't call themselves Slavs, you know. they called themselves by their tribal names. It was usually similar to either family names, you know, because larger clans, or names that were from the place where they lived, you know, or I don't know, from the north or the mountains or the this or the that, you know what I mean? So, and these tribes were also in conflict with themselves a lot. That's what also the sources say. They say that the tribes, you can't make peace with them, because if you make peace with one tribe, the other tribe is going to attack you. If you make peace with the other tribe is going to attack you, you know? So they were fighting between themselves. They were killing their leaders, which they actually had. They didn't have leaders in the beginning, so they started having leaders like a bit later when they came in contact. So a lot of tribes were influenced by different cultures, you know what I mean? There's not a specific Slavic pottery. There's not a specific Slavic fibula, you know what I mean, or bracelet. But from the archaeology that we have, for the people who are targeted as Slavic, there is very little evidence of representations of gods. And the reason for this is, I would say, primarily because they didn't need to represent these things, because the spirituality was more animistic, and it was more well, yeah, related to ancestors, to forest spirits, to spirits of everything. You know what's animism, I don't have to explain. But we have some archaeological evidence. For example, we have the Zbruch idol. The Zbruch idol is, for example, dated to the 9th century, and that's found in Ukraine. That's the idol, if you remember, in the Northman, there is the Slavic witch that appears, and behind her there is an idol, you know. And the Slavic witch, which is played by Björk, you remember?
Yeah, yeah.
And behind her there is this idol. This idol, for example, is also controversial because it's not found on an archaeological site. It was found like in a river. So people don't know to which culture it belonged or how to place it. Some say it's Slavic, some say it's not Slavic, some say it's not even real. They say it's not even a real artifact that belonged to any culture. They say that it's made in the 19th century, you know. So you can't be sure about this. And this is yet one of the most recognizable Slavic idols you'll find everywhere. Yeah. So because it fits the description, for example, of Cvetković on the island of Rügen, because he had 4 heads, and this idol has 4 faces, but at the same time it has 4 figures, so it doesn't really match. People kind of identified with Cvetković, but there's really no basis for this. Yeah. So aside from pottery and jewelry and tools, you know, all of these things, there isn't much religious images found. There is a hoard found in Velestino. That's, by the way, it comes from Veles, the god. That's in Greece, today's Greece. There is some artifacts found there, like plaques, you know. Some of them, some scholars interpret them as maybe religious objects. Some of them interpret them maybe simply as nothing really special, because, you know, it's a human with an axe, for example. So are you going to interpret him as a deity like Perun, or are you going to interpret him as a warrior? You know. So when you compare the images, it's possible to interpret them as deities. I kind of support this, but at the same time, we don't really know. You know what I mean? So it's very problematic when it comes to archaeology, because we have some idols, for example, that are boundary markers, like a human shape with a belt and a sword, for example, or a horn, but like they don't appear across the whole Slavic world, you know. So
yeah, so that's kind of my next question. Yeah, and I like what you said about Yeah, there maybe not being so many statues of gods and idols like we might have from the Viking Age, right? But
Yeah.
it was the exact same thing if we go back to like the migration period or antiquity. Like the Germanic peoples did not have statues or anything of evidence of worship of the gods then too. So they were both kind of animistic then at the start of it. So that's what people should understand there. That the animism type things are our original beliefs. But is there any, can you tell any difference between the beliefs and practices among the different Slavic countries or regions? Of course, they all followed the same general type of family of the native beliefs, but do you know of any differences that we can tell from what we know?
There are, well, I'm going to kind of continue from the archaeological, part. For example, we all know the hammer of Thor, but there is also amulets which are believed to represent the axe of Perun, right? So everybody today wears an amulet of Perun, right? Even I have one. But in reality, these amulets of axes like that are mostly found among the Eastern Slavic areas. And amulets with axes exist in Europe even since Roman times, from Ireland to Russia. You know what I mean? So we can't tie them specifically to Slavs, right? And furthermore, they're not even found like amulets. I think only 4 or 5 of them are found. They might have been pins or something like that. So, but nevertheless, they're still found in the Eastern Slavic area. Some scholars suggest that it's a kind of fashion thing. Maybe they got from the Varangians. Maybe some of them maybe had the Thor's hammer. But for example, the 4-headed deity Svantevit, which we know from the Western Slavic sources, who was worshipped on the island of Rügen, today's Germany. He's described, for example, as having 4 heads. So, but his name, Svantevit, which is not Svetovid, I should say for all the viewers here, Svetovid does not exist in any source. Svetovid is totally an adaptation of the name to fit the name Vid, which is a Slavic name of Saint Vitus, and there is a long story here. So all the sources mention him as Vita with a T, and that suffix means something else than Vida. So he is described as having 4 faces, 4 heads, and his cult, for example, is said to be among those tribes the highest cult, right? He was like their highest god. However, we have other sources that say, among other areas, that they had different higher gods. So in the Western Slavic area, for example, we have Prove, who is probably a local variation of Perun, who didn't have an idol, who was worshipped under an oak tree in an oak grove, right? And he was the main god of these tribes that were here. Then we have Triglav, which means 3-headed. He's also described as the highest god of these people, but he's not the same. We have Svarožić, which is basically descendant of Svarog, it means the name, who is worshipped as a war deity and so forth. All of them have similar things in the sense that when the people were raiding, much of the plunder was given as an offering to the temples. And in all temples, there was horse divination of these 3 deities, for example. But these 3 deities are different, and yet they're described as the highest deities of the people. So we obviously have a different cult, as the highest deity. Then we have, for example, Svantevit, who was regarded as the highest, is represented with 4 heads, as I said, and yet his name only appears in this area. However, for example, we have, if we exclude this brooch idol, like a forgery, let's say, we have antlers idols, like amulets carved into antler from the 9th or 10th centuries in the Balkans, which are representations of this deity with 4 heads, you know. So it means that this was probably a known image, which was common Slavic, because there's many things which are common Slavic, but that these guys simply gave it a local name, which was probably an epithet or something. And there's the whole story about the origin of the name. The Christian guys, you know, the scholars of that time, they explain how this came. I don't know if we should go into the topic, but yeah. For example, another thing is today in Slovenia, for example, where they have some preserved a lot of these cultural pagan elements. You barely find the name of any Slavic deity there. You know, they have totally different, and yet the myth is the same. So you have Kresnik, for example, who rides a chariot, who kills a dragon, who steals the cattle, who everything, you know, who is identical to Perun basically in many aspects, and yet there are some local things. But he is not even called Perun, you know what I mean? So a lot of things are very local, and the sources that come to us about them are with big gaps, and there shouldn't be a misconception that there was a common Slavic pantheon. That's what scholars are trying to reconstruct, okay, like the Proto-Slavic pantheon, but that's also a hypothesis, because there was no centralized Slavic entity, like a state with an organized religion, you know what I mean, with similarities to the Greco-Roman cults, you know, because they were all tribes, and some tribes simply had other deities or not. So there's a lot of varieties, and when I speak about Slavic mythology in my books, I kind of try to connect all the dots, but at the same time make sure that I kind of say that they're all, you know, separate things from separate time periods.
Yeah, so that's really. Do you think it's do you think that they're so different because they had changed over time with Christianity, and they were still kind of during pagan times they were a lot similar, or do you think we have to go back even further to like very long ago Proto-Slavic times before they all had the same kind of religion, before it was all one?
I think that most of them are actually very similar, you know, but they kind of manifest in a different local way. You know, for example, we have names of deities such as, I don't know, Perun and Veles, for example, that appear in all 3 branches, right? 3-headed figures, like Triglav in the Western Slav. You have Trojan in a folklore way among the South Slavs, and who is also a 3-headed folklore creature, but close ties to Triglav in any case, like it's an absolutely chthonic being. And I think that all of them pretty much share the same structure, you know, like what I explained with Kresnik in Slovenia. The myths around it are the same, you know, but Slavic languages are such that there's a lot of names and nicknames even that are kind of like epithets, and even today, you know. So I think that pretty much there were a lot of similarities, similar deities, but the people simply called them in a local variation. Like if I call it Black God and you call it Veles, it's just different ways of saying it, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Of course, similar to the Norse. Most people watching from the Norse religion and the gods, like especially the main gods, they have dozens of different names that they refer to, so they can notice something similar there.
And I think in Germanic mythology, sorry to interrupt, but like we also have a similar thing. Now imagine if we would speak about Germanic mythology as a whole. You can speak about it. You have Norse mythology, right? And continental and Anglo-Saxon. You know, of course, they have similarities, but there are some deities of continental Germanic people that the historians mention that we have no idea who they were. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with Slavic. Like they mention some deities, I don't know, in some areas we have no idea who they are, what they were, you know. And on top of that, these Latin scholars, like, they butchered the names in most times, you know, because they can't pronounce Slavic names, so they write something random. And now today we have to interpret it, and we have like 5 interpretations. We don't even know what it is. Oh, he could be a god of the sun. Oh no, he could actually be a god of who wants human sacrifice. Or no, he could actually be this. In the end, it doesn't even matter anymore, you know, because the essence is gone. You can't find it, you know.
Yep. Yeah, like always, difficult things that we're never going to know. How about the afterlife? What do we know about that?
The afterlife is interesting. We, of course, don't know anything about the afterlife from the sources that I mentioned before. We know mostly from folklore. We actually do know from one source, Western Slavic, Polish source. I forgot the name. Sorry. He basically says that the people had a god who they called, who he identifies with Pluto, and they called him Nia, or Ni. And that the people asked him for good positions in the afterlife, you know. So he was kind of the guardian of the spirits, he says. However, there have been attempts to connect this being, which appears only, I should say, in this Western Slavic Polish area. So maybe it's a local name for the common Slavic deity, or, you know, we can't really be certain. There have been attempts to connect him to, for example, Nav, the word, which is one of the names that appears for the other world. And in all Slavic languages, you have spirits who are malevolent spirits, who are called Navi or Navki or something similar, you know. So it means from Nav, yeah. So, but these spirits are malevolent. Now, are they malevolent because Christianity made them so? Or were they originally malevolent because Nav was some spirit realm of people who were suicidal, or who were dishonorable, or who were, you know, outcasts of community? We don't really know. That's the thing. We don't really know how Nav looked like either, you know. Nav basically means death or corpse or something like that. So it's a place of the dead, simply. But the general reconstruction is that Veles was the deity of the other world. And in Eastern Slavic sources, for example, we have another name for this other world, which is called Iri. And that's like in relation to the Slavic world today, which is called for paradise, it's Raj. And this is imagined something like the afterlife of Freya, or the afterlife, the Elysium fields, you know, a vast green other world where everybody lives in good harmony with everything. They don't need anything, right? So, like, it's always nice and sunny there, and there's pastures and cows and all of these things, right? And the lord of the underworld is Veles, and we know that it's Veles. Commonly, I would say we have more evidence that it's Veles than Ni, if maybe it's not even a local name for him, because we can see it in place names. We can see it in historical sources. For example, there's 15th and 16th century Czech sources that say that somebody will go beyond the sea to Veles, for example, you know. And then Veles is identified also with the devil. So the afterlife is beyond the sea. That's where the devil is, or Veles, actually. And he has these pastures for all the grazing animals, and people live there and so forth. And there's also the belief that the spirits reincarnate, and there is the metaphor given of birds, like migratory birds, for example, are said to go to the place of Iri, to the ancestral realm in the winter, and they return to our world in spring, and they bring back spring from that realm. So it's kind of this evergreen place where they return from. But in reality, we don't really know, because this is located supposedly somewhere beyond the sea or somewhere beyond the Milky Way, as another belief says, and at the same time somewhere underground, and at the same time somewhere in the roots of the cosmic tree, right? So we don't have like a map of the geography of where this is and this is and how it is, you know. And I don't think that we even need to, and they didn't need to, probably, because that was for them a living thing, you know. They didn't need to categorize things in folders and maps and all this stuff, right?
So I mean, it's easy to look at the Norse sources or the Greek sources for that, because it seems exactly like, or very similar to the Norse head, and was of course going all the way back to Proto-Indo-European times. It would have been the same place, so just developed. But they can, if Slavic people want to discover a bit more about the afterlife, they could look into the Norse sources, because from what you're saying, it sounds very, very similar.
It does sound very similar, but again, what I'm saying is folklore, you know. That's what I said. It's the second layer that kind of gives substance to the first layer of dry sources, because folklore preserved a lot of things in a Christianized way in most often, but sometimes even not, you know. So yeah, the afterlife, I mean, I guess there will be a question maybe about Slavic Norse parallels, right? But one of the parallels is that there is this cosmic tree, for example. And on top of the cosmic tree, there is the eagle, same. Below there is the dragon, there is snakes and so forth, same. There is either a lake or a well or any water spring or river or whatever under the tree, which is again the same. That's where, in a lot of cases, again in folklore, the Slavic Norns, who are called Narečnici or Suđenice or different local names, they're also sitting there beside a well or a lake. Sometimes they appear as fairies, you know. So a lot of the things are the same, you know. It's just that we don't have the real source, so to speak, like a real myth where, like, I don't know, for example, Odin goes down to revive a dead seer, right? We know where he's going and what he's doing. Here we don't really have that big of a detail. But yeah.
That's really amazing that all of these things that you're speaking about came from the folklore. And of course, in Scandinavia, we have folklore too, but it rarely goes into the actual mythology of pre-Christian times. But it sounds like the Slavic folklore, it goes into it much more. So that's actually really amazing that it lasted that long.
Yes, it is. That's how they fill a lot of gaps. They use folklore, and now some of them are more reliable, some of them are not, some of them are good interpretations, some of them not. And there is not really a place where you can just go and just see how it was, you know, what's the good or bad thing. You really have to do the whole research by yourself. And yeah.
How about reincarnation? You spoke about it a little here, and I've seen you do videos speaking about it a little bit, but how much do we know about their belief in reincarnation?
We don't have, again, a source about reincarnation, but I think one of the main factors that points towards reincarnation is simply the tradition to give your children the names of their ancestors, which was, I mean, I think you don't need a source for this, you know, like that's what still people do, right? And that kind of obviously points to the idea that the spirit was connected to the name, and that the dead or the qualities of the dead are somehow revived when this happens. We don't have any, for example, you have in the sagas and so forth, like moments where people enter the burial mounds and maybe take an object or things like that, that can be interpreted like reincarnation. But most of Slavic burial mounds are actually ashes, you know, because people mostly cremated the dead. So there is no, basically they put it in burial urns and like covered it with a mound, and that's it, you know, with some offerings inside, possessions maybe of the person. So we don't really have these things or mentioned anywhere. But there is a very interesting thing that I recently found out, and that's a very interesting Norse and Slavic parallel again. And it's about reincarnation. And it's, wait, I have it written down here, sorry, because...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so there is this saga which is called the Icelandic saga of the people of Vatnsdal. Okay,
yeah,
I guess you know it.
Yeah.
So there is this guy, Thorstein, I think it was called, and he goes, and he has to kill this giant man who lives in the forest, who is Jökull, and he basically wounds him mortally, and Jökull says, well, he says what he says, and in the end he says, take my sister as your wife, because I think you're a good man. Take my sister as your wife, and name one of my kids, one of your kids after me, so that my name can live on. So we have the clear example of reincarnation, right? The exact same thing exists in Serbian epic poetry, where we have, for example, the figure who is called Prince Marko Kraljević. And before he is born, his father attacks basically the fort of another nobleman who is called Duke Momčilo. And Duke Momčilo has a sister and a wife. His wife betrays him to the aggressor, who is called Vukašin, okay? And in the end, Vukašin manages to stab him, mortally wounds him, and Momčilo says, take my sister as your wife, and she will give birth to you, to sons who will be great heroes like me. And then Marko is born from this marriage, and it says, this song finishes, Marko was just like his uncle. So it's, I don't know what more you need. It's even if we don't have the sources, we have the sources. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's of course people. If we go back far enough, in any Indo-European cultures, they all believed in reincarnation at some point. But it's just how far we have to go back to see that evidence. But it's easier for certain cultures than others. But for everyone to know, we all believed in that at a certain point.
Well, there's no reason not to, like everything is a cycle in nature. It seems only normal that was the belief, especially when we're going back to animistic times. Because Slavic, the gods and this pantheon and things like that, they developed. I wanted to say this earlier, if you don't mind. Most of the things we have, like Slavic temples, description of idols, so forth, it's all from the 9th, 10th, 11th, so forth centuries. So we have nothing before. And by the 9th century, Christianity in some Slavic lands was already present. So it's obvious that these temples and these social organizations and so forth, they came about as a reaction to the neighboring Christian tribes, peoples, not tribes like empires and so forth. And the tribes emerged into a more semi-civilization, I would say, still kind of a tribal community, but larger, with a leader, with a priest, with a temple, because in the past they didn't have that. In the past they had trees, and for example, here in Serbia, now you can go to a church, and you will see next to the church there is a holy tree which is probably 500 years old. And in villages where there was no churches in the past, marriages, baptisms, all of these things, gatherings to discuss all of those things, until the 19th century, they were performed under the tree of the village. The Christians just put a cross on it. And that was it.
Yeah, same everywhere. It was like all the celebrations and things were centered around these sacred trees and sacred sites in nature. It didn't necessarily have temples. So we could speak about the practices. One thing that I found very cool about it is there is some still existing Slavic pagan practices, and it's not like any thing in the other pagan kind of religions that we see around Europe. It's a lot of like people reconstructing modern practices, and honestly, especially in the north, there's a lot of weirdos. There's a lot of people doing some weird things out in the woods, like some strange people that you wouldn't really want to go around.
The peaceful
But I was so no, in the Norse. In any kind of Norse modern community. But one thing I was so happy to see about in these Slavic pagan communities, they're normal people. It's like, there's families there, there's men, there's women, they're looking like they're just totally regular people. As one of my favorite boxers, actually, Aleksandar, I think he follows some of those old traditions too, and it's like a really beautiful celebration, and these festivals. But what are the ones that are still existing that people might want to join? If there are any people watching in the east of Europe, how would they go about finding these? And can you tell us a little bit about the most common practices that are still practiced today, and what they might have been like 1,000 years ago?
So this is a bit problematic, because in the east of Europe especially, there is a lot of these groups, that are reviving paganism, and that's good. But there's also a lot of bad consequences as a side effect, kind of. And I'll just tell you why. I just want to say that I don't know any groups that people can join or find them, because I'm not part of any such group. We had kind of an attempt to form such a group where I'm from. It ended up not very good. There was even some media attempts to frame us like we're Russian terrorists or something. So we were like, okay, let's just drop this, because I don't want to get involved in being set up for whatever. So yeah, in the east of Europe, there is a lot of this revival thing, but there is also a lot of New Age. I don't want to say bad words, okay, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, we know the cringe pagans. That's how I call them.
And there's a lot of, for example, I don't identify. There is this thing which is called rodnoveri, for example, and this translates as native faith, and there is nothing bad about it, But I personally don't want to identify with this term. It's not an ancient term, okay? Just to make it clear. I don't want to identify with this term because it encompasses so many New Age cults and sects in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Poland, whatever, that have nothing to do with real paganism. They invent some fabrications, some fake sources, some science fictional, I don't know what, like we came from I don't know where, Perun came with a spaceship. There's all of those things, you know what I mean? Like there's a church of native believers that literally looks like a Christian church, you know what I mean? Like all of these, it's not very nice, And there's the other side, which is actually quite positive. And that's what I like about it, as you said. I'm totally supportive of that, why not? The more such things we have, the better for us, right? Most of these groups, I can't say actually most of these groups, but there's a lot of groups that celebrate festivals which are fictional, which didn't exist in the past, for deities that we don't have any evidence that existed, unfortunately. So other groups are more based in reality, and you really kind of have to see for yourself how the people are and where you can fit in if somebody wants to join these things. But most of them practice definitely the solstices and the equinoxes, because that's one of the things that are practiced since forever. And it's basically the same. You have from the winter equinox, then you have a Slavic cognate which is called Gromnica or Sretenje, or different names. We don't know how the pagan one is called, but basically which is the equivalent of what is Imbolc. Then you have the 7 fat days where you eat, cheese and crepes and all these things. Then you have the 40-day fasting period. You have Easter, where people decorate eggs, and There is the burning of the winter effigy of the goddess Morana Mara. There is the equivalent of 1st of May, which is the day of Yarilom, which is today the Saint George Day. That's one of the myths, the folklore behind Saint George's Day, for example, served as a basis for the reconstruction of the myth of Yarilom and Mara. And that's basically, from what I understand, the equivalent of Freyr and Freya. We can talk about that if you want later. Of course, the summer solstice, there is also a day which is regarded as Perun's Day. This is in the Orthodox calendar today, this is the 20th of July, I think. Yeah. For example, on this day, this is very interesting. Like, this is how, for example, we don't have evidence of how the rituals were practiced, and yet we have modern ethnographic sources, right? So where I'm from, for example, there is this mountain top that's called Peren, just Peren. And there was an oak grove there until mid-20th century before they cut it down. And there is a sacred spring. And fortunately, somebody went there to document this event. So we know it today. Basically, the people on the day of Saint Ilya, that's Saint Elijah in English pronunciation, who replaced Perun. So he drives his chariots of fire through the sky, you know, and kills the devils and the dragons with his lightning bolts, you know, like, this is the saint I grew up with, you know. And I was like, what the fuck, you know? So people go there in this Peren mountaintop in the oak grove. All of them in the past, they raised either a cattle or a ram together in the village. Afterwards, they all simply donated money to buy it. They went there. There is a person who sacrifices it, and this is all for the saint, you know. The person who sacrifices it, the people, the women at home, they make these round breads. They also offer them. There is a stone altar, basically, kind of next to the water. They offer them there. The man sacrifices this animal, and they cook it all together in big pots. And there is this huge stone table with stone chairs, basically. It's like it's not carved or anything. It's just aligned like that. Who knows since when, you know? And the whole village simply sits there and eats this thing, you know. So this is nothing Christian about it, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Even though they call it Saint Elias Day,
yeah,
of course, but they did this everywhere. They took the pagan holidays and just called it something Christian, but the people still did the same things.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So a lot of these things are preserved. I actually kind of went into mythology, Slavic mythology, because I was interested in what the hell we're doing at home with these Easter eggs and with these breads and with these porks for winter, you know, and with these rituals, all of them that we have. And that's how I actually understood that if you remove all of these things from Christianity, there will be nobody interested to be Christian anymore, you know, because everybody wants to be Christian here, at least, you know, because they have these celebrations, you know, which are absolutely pagan to the core. So I would say a lot of things have survived. A lot of things, of course, have changed and have not survived because society has changed. We can't perform the same things like we did in the early Middle Ages, right? But if there is any festival, for example, if you want me to speak about, or any specific ritual, I can say something. Otherwise, I think that's pretty much it.
Yep. Sounds good. Yes, it's great that we could do a whole other episode on that. I think just those things. But you've actually answered some of my last questions already with that. But speaking about the gods and the symbolism behind them, I've heard you speak about it in your videos before, and of course in the Norse tradition, it's relatively easy to see what the gods symbolize, because most of the gods' names actually translate to mean something like exactly what they're symbolic of, and some you have to look a little bit deeper. But what about the Slavic gods' names? Is there any, what kinds of clues of what they are symbolic for do we still have? Is it as simple as translating their names, or is it a bit more difficult than that?
Well, it depends on the gods, as always. Where do I start now? There's like 10,000 names that I can...
maybe just a couple of them, and
let's say, for example, Perun is easy to understand, because Per is the notion of striking, and Un is simply a suffix that says who is doing it. So it's the one who is striking, the one who is hitting, right? Because he's the one who's striking down the evil forces and the dishonorable people, right? Same as Thor. So that's easy to understand. Veles, for example, is not easy to understand at all, because Veles is such a deep etymology that some of them, you know, there is the etymology that connects him to wool, for example, because he is like this deity which is related to herds, to sheep, and so forth. And we have folklore like in the other world there is like black sheepskin and a snake on top and so forth. So like it makes sense, and he's also described in some places as with a big beard and so forth. Yeah. So it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense when you connect him to the Baltic equivalent, right? Which is Velnias, and Veles and similar terms are used for the spirits of the dead. So obviously Vel or Well is somehow also related to death, but we don't have this word in Slavic languages anymore, you know. And this is ultimately also connected to Valhall and Valor, you know, the fallen in battle and so forth. At the same time, he's also connected to terms like Volshebstvo, which is sorcery, basically, Volshba, because he's also a deity. So like you can't give him one etymology. And I think there is a lot of, I don't want to sound weird here, but I think that modern etymology kind of has a problem to be one-lined. Well, I think in the past people didn't think like that at all. You know, I think the terminology could be applied in reality to all of these fields when it comes to Veles and or other deities. It's just that today we have to follow these rules, you know. But in the past, people didn't really care about these things, right? We have a deity who is called Yarovit in the Western Slavic, or Yarilo in South and Eastern Slavic sources. This is basically a deity which appears, which was replaced by Saint George. But when we compare the folklore, the folk songs that are sung on Saint George's Day, we can find out this is done by Radoslav Katičić, the Croatian author. He has the book called Zeleni Lug about this. That's one of the books I would recommend. That he appears basically as the savior of the goddess Mara, who is threatened, by a dragon, right? So he saves her. They marry, but it ends up them being brother and sister. Well, you know how that is in mythology. I think we have the same analogy in the Norse mythology, right?
Yeah.
And this is kind of even more emphasized when you look at Yarilo, how he was represented. He was represented always with the big, you know, with the big phallic symbols, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
And this is obviously, I mean, the same god. He kind of is also connected to warfare, but at the same time to crops. And his name is derived from Yar. Now, Yar, the root, gives us also year in English, the proto-root, I don't mean the Slavic root. And Yar in the Slavic languages is connected to terms which are For example, it means spring, but it also can mean, is used for young vegetation terms, you know, like vegetation terms or animal terms for young for young animals, newborn things, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he's related to the rebirth of nature, you know, because he appears in when summer begins, basically in I would say across all of Europe. This is one of the characteristics of the Slavic calendar as well. We have two main seasons, you know, it's summer and winter.
Yep.
When the summer begins, that's when Yarilo arrives. That's his characteristic. And when they marry, so to speak, it's like the blooming of vegetation in the summer solstice. Then we have Mara, for example, which appears as his sister and wife, or Morana, and similar other names that I don't have to pronounce now for other people. This is basically also easy to link to death, because more, even today, we say, you have this term in English terminology, mortum, or whatever, you have it in Latin. And she has been interpreted as a goddess of death, but this is not fully complete, because the rituals that burn the effigy of Mara, for example, to burn the winter away, they always bring back like a decorated tree, which is the new summer, the new season starting, the new spring, actually. And we know from South Slavic folk songs that she is born on the Easter, so she's kind of connected to this Easter goddess, and therefore she's not only a goddess of death, but also a goddess of the new season. But like later on, she becomes this goddess of death through the myth, because either she grows old or she dies or whatever, and eventually, you know, it's a symbol, a representation of the changing of the season through the biological, I would say, function of a woman. You know, she's young and hot in youth, and then she becomes a mother and so forth. The vegetation blooms, she grows older into an old hag, and she represents winter, right? Similar myths with local variations all over Europe. Like maybe in some places it's going to be an old hag that captures the maiden, maybe, you know, but everywhere is kind of the same. So that's what her name means. We can speak about Cvetković if you want. That's it's an interesting story. For example, this deity, which was worshipped in the Rugen island, he was recorded like Svantevit or Sventovit. Now, the first word is basically means like holy, but it could have meant also something like strong and divine, simply, you know, not holy necessarily like in the Latin way, like sacred, but maybe something more in the sense of hail, you know, like a whole, something like that.
Yeah.
And vit, the suffix vit, is interpreted in different ways. So basically, I'm kind of a supporter of the idea that it's a suffix that kind of describes the quality of the guy, of the figure, because we have similar names in the same Slavic area with the suffix vit. So, for example, he's Svantevit, but then we have Jarovit, then we have Rujevit, Porevit, and so forth. And for example, to say, I always kind of give this example. To say forest, you say, for example, les or shuma, right? And to say forested, like a hill or a coast that has a forest, you say shumovit, you know. So Cvetković is the one who is kind of imbued with this divine power. Could this be an epithet of Perun, or the highest god of the Slavic people? Absolutely yes. You know, in the same way, Yarovit is the god who is imbued with the power of Yar, you know, of the growth power, so to speak, you know, and so forth. However, the Western chroniclers, you know, those guys who wrote, the German Christians, basically, I think it was Adam of Bremen who wrote, and another guy, they basically tell us what happened there, you know, and this is a big confusion. I am of the opinion, for example, that Svantevid was originally a figure like Perun, but that he simply developed into a local cult and maybe got a different name as an epithet. Or we don't know much, you know. We know what the sources tell us, and the sources also tell us that basically this island was Christianized before this cult appeared. So what they say is that some Christian missionaries came there and they brought the cult of Saint Vitus to the place. And the cult of Saint Vitus, after a while, was turned into a deity. How? Basically, the missionaries, the Christians left, and the common folk like just abandoned Christianity, but they kind of preserved the name of the saint. And then we got Svantevid. That's what the sources say. Because in the Slavic languages, when you say Saint Vitus, you say saint, you say Sveti. And to say Vitus, you say Vit. So Svetivit and Svantevid are basically very similar in sound. And that's what the Christian monks are telling us. However, now it's a matter of interpretation. Are we going to trust them or are we not going to trust them, right? Some scholars are like, there's no way this could have happened because the people definitely already had the deity which was called Saint Svantevid. So they just put Saint Vitus on top, and then Adam of Bremen and these guys, they just gave a story which was matching their agenda. And there's the other scholars who are saying, well, no, actually, they're telling us the truth, you know. So you will never know, right? You can believe in something, but factual evidence doesn't exist. But that's the name of this deity, if we kind of see it from a Slavic perspective. Yeah, I would say that's pretty much.
Yeah, we can go on all day, I'm sure, with all the gods. So yeah, people can definitely go and check out your channel. Everyone should go there, especially those in Eastern Europe or those with Eastern European ancestry. So it won't take up any more of your time. Is there anything before we finish? Any sources you'd like to recommend on this subject if people like to learn more? Books, I know you have a book. Or any other ones that you would recommend people look at if they want to learn more in English or Slavic languages?
Yes, I would say the book recommendations, most of them I have are in Slavic. So it's a bit difficult, but yeah, that's that. I would say, for example, there is this journal which is called Studia Mythologica Slavica. That's I think in Latin. And this is like a journal where people publish their research in English as well, mostly in Slavic, but English, German, Italian sometimes, you know, so people can check that out. They will find probably some English things there, and they will find also a lot of Slavic things there, and that's, again, mostly folklore, comparison, comparative mythology, and so forth. Aside from that, there's these classic authors who kind of built the base for the reconstruction. That's Vyacheslav Ivanov and Vladimir Toporov. So I don't even have to recommend their book. Just check out the authors. They have even research papers separate from books, which are mostly in Russian. But hey, you can find things translated in English, I'm sure. There is also Boris Rybakov, who has a book called paganism of old Russia, ancient Russia. I haven't really read it. I've read segments. It's a bit weird, but yeah, people can read it. Why not? I particularly like the ethnologist of Serbian origin, which is Veselin Čajkanović. I always kind of recommend him. So he has a book called O vrhovnom bogu u staroj srpskoj religiji. That's about the highest god in the old Serbian religion. And Myth I religija u Srba, which is mythology and religion among the Serbs, and all of his other books as well. There is a guy from Macedonia who is called Nikos Čausidis. He is good as well. He has two books which I particularly like. That's South Slavic, the mythical images of the South Slavs, and the cosmological images. And this guy also writes like papers that you can find online, I think on academia.com or something like that, like because he's still active, he's a professor or something. So I think he's doing a good job. There is Radoslav Katičić, that's a Croatian author. He has basically all of his books. You can check them out on mythology. Božanski boy, Zeleni Lug, Gazdarica na vratima, I think. Then there is the Bulletin of Ethnographic Institute of Belgrade, which I also find interesting because ethnographic evidence is important, you know. So that's pretty much it. Aleksandar Loma, I would also suggest. That's a good author. He has a very good book which is called Prakosovo, which is basically the Slavic and Indo-European roots of Serbian epic poetry. And this is a very good book for me. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can talk about now, but yeah, I can't believe that 1 hour passed already. This was so quick.
Yeah, even the books, we can speak for an hour about it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much sums it up.
Sounds good, and we can put the titles below in the description of the video.
Yeah,
awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. That's great to learn about, and yeah, lots of things that I had no idea were so similar actually. So yeah, it might even be worth it for people following the Norse old beliefs to look into some Slavic folklore to learn a little bit more about and fill in the blanks of our old religion. So yeah, that's all about it. Thank you for joining, and you guys can be sent over to his channel, and I hope you'll follow him there.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope we can get to have more such interactions, I guess, you know, because the more we share, the more knowledge grows, the more, well, everything is better for the common people, right? So that's
exactly. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much as well. Bye bye.